Good evening, everybody. Welcome to New Walk Church. Would you all stand with us as we sing together tonight? We're so excited to be in the house worshiping with you all. Sing this with us. It's called Stand. Our hope, this is our peace, faithful is our God. He will come through, we won't be moved, faithful is our God. Oh yeah. This is our strength, this is our shield, faithful is our God. He cannot fail, we will prevail. Faithful is our God. Oh yes, we are standing, 'cause the enemy is defeated. We'll always be standing on the promises of Jesus. Lifting our eyes, gone is the night. Faithful is our God. His enemies under our feet. Faithful is our God. Oh yes, we are standing, 'cause the enemy's defeated. We'll always be standing on the promises of Jesus. Yes, my soul says yes to your promises. My soul says yes, yes. My soul says yes. My soul says yes to your promises. Sing it out. Yes, my soul says yes to your promises. My soul says yes, yes. My soul says yes. My soul says yes to your promises. Oh yes, we are standing, 'cause the enemy's defeated. We'll always be standing on the promises of Jesus. Oh yes, we are standing, 'cause the enemy's defeated. We'll always be standing on the promises of Jesus. If you would take a minute to say hello to somebody next to you. We're so glad to have you all with us at New Walk tonight.
I give you glory for all you brought me through, and now I'm ready for whatever you want to do. I'm moving forward to Your presence is an open door. So come now, Lord, like never before. Come on, church, let's put our hands together. Come on, no spectators tonight. It's all lift up our voices. Look at that, I know. I know breakthrough is coming. By faith, I see your miracle. My God made me a promise and it won't stop now. I know breakthrough is coming. By faith, I see your miracle. My God made me a promise and it won't stop now. I know breakthrough is coming. By faith, I see a miracle. My God made me a promise and it won't stop now. I know breakthrough is coming. By faith, I see a miracle. My God made me a promise and it won't stop now. Come on, every voice. Your presence is an open door. We want you, Lord, like never before. Your presence is an open door. So come now, Lord, like never before. There's people in this place right now who may be battling depression, anxiety. Maybe there's a sin in your life that you are just at war with. Maybe your marriage is, it feels like it's hanging on by a thread. But let me tell you that when you put your faith and your hope and your trust in Jesus, regardless of your situation, there is breakthrough to be had. There's breakthrough in your addiction. There's breakthrough in your marriage. So all across this place, you will lift your hands. Lift your hands and we're going to sing this out with one voice. I know breakthrough is coming. Amen? Let's sing it out. And I know breakthrough is coming. By faith, I see a miracle. My God made me a promise and it won't stop now. Come on, you gotta sing it out. I know. I know breakthrough is coming. By faith, I see a miracle. My God made me a promise and it won't stop now. I know breakthrough is coming. By faith, I see a miracle. My God made me a promise and it won't stop now. Sing it one more time. I know breakthrough is coming. By faith, I see a miracle. My God made me a promise and it won't stop now. All across this place, lift up a shout of praise to our God today.
Let's sing this together. You give life, you are love, So we pour out our praise to you only. Yeah. Then sings my soul, my Savior God, to thee. How great thou art, how great thou art. Then sings my soul, my Savior God, to thee. How great thou art, how great thou art, how great you are. How great you are, God. How great you are. How great you are. Sing that out. Then sings my soul. Then sings my soul, my Savior to thee. How great thou art, how great thou art. Then sings my soul, my Savior God, to thee. How great thou art, how great thou art. Amen. You may be seated.
Hey everyone, welcome to New Walk Church. Whether you're joining us online or here in person, we are so glad that you're spending part of your day with us. My name's Cammie. As you can see, we have an amazing worship team. But that's just the beginning. In a minute, one of our pastors will come out to share the message with you that you can apply throughout the week. As you walked in, you should have been given some message notes. These are a great way to follow along and refer back to. If you didn't get them, raise your hand and we'll get some to you right away. Inside those message notes is something we call a Connect card. It's important for everyone to fill out as much information as you feel comfortable sharing. Be sure to drop it in the blue bucket that will be pastoring offering at the end of the worship experience. Now, if this is your first time visiting New Walk, we consider you a VIP. We have a small gift that we want to give you as a token of our appreciation for visiting with us. You'll need to take your Connect card with you as you leave and stop by our VIP table, which is located outside the main entrance under the big blue awning. We are so excited that you're here, and we want you to know that your past will never define your future. No matter who you are or where you've been, we're glad that you're here with us. If you have kids with you, we want to let you know that we have a fantastic kids program happening throughout the entire experience. It's safe, it's secure, and most importantly, it will be the best day of their week. Our children's ministry is fun and engaging with a message that is delivered at their level. There's still time to check them in, so get there now. If you're looking for your next steps in learning more about the church or serving, then boot camp is for you. There we will teach you all about the history and mission of our church, as well as helping you get plugged into a serve team. Boot camp happens this Sunday at 11:15 in our cafe. All you have to do is just show up. Thanks so much for being here with us this weekend at New Walk. We believe that you're here for a reason and that God has something He wants to say to you wherever you're at. Our hope is that you leave today encouraged and closer to Him than ever before. Be sure to stay connected with us on social media at My New Walk Church to stay up to date on everything that's happening here at New Walk. We hope that you and your family have a great weekend. And once again, thank you for joining us today. Welcome home.
Hey, y'all. Thanks for coming to see us tonight. Thankful for our crowd that does attend one of the 2 Saturday night services because, man, we are in the time where it's getting busy on Sunday morning. So thank you for that. Continue our series called The Gospels. Remember last week we said, before we talk about the Gospels, let me talk about the Gospel. So there's a little difference between the two. So let's do a little refresher about last week, the Gospel versus the Gospels. Last week we dealt with the Gospel. We'll put it up on the screen. What is the Gospel? It's in essence related to Jesus' life, the story of Jesus' life, the good news that Jesus came to be the Messiah that was promised, and forgiveness of our sin for all of mankind, not just the Jews but the Gentiles, be able to spend an eternity in heaven, and what Jesus Christ was going to do on the cross. The story of His life is the gospel, and the gospel is theology. It's not just journalism or a nice story. It's an understanding of who God is when we understand the gospel. Now, then, the Gospels, plural, is this: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, 4 books of the Bible, the first 4 books of the New Testament. The Gospels are who Jesus was, what Jesus said, what Jesus did in His life. That's the Gospels. Now, so we have the Gospel, the truth about Jesus and His life and all that happened, and then we have 4 books of the Bible that tell that story. We call them, plural, the Gospels. Last week we did the gospel. I'm unpacking this a little bit more now as we go through the Gospels. We're going to go with Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Here's what we know, that this Jesus that everybody was talking about coming finally came. All out history through the Old Testament that there would be a Messiah, there would be a Messiah. In fact, what you need to understand is that when you're considering the Old Testament, we've talked about this before, the Old Testament is preparing us for the revealing of what we have in the New Testament. So much of the Old Testament is it's all pointing to Jesus. Let me give you this text in Genesis chapter 3. Let's go all the way to Genesis, talking about the Messiah right here. So the Lord God said to the serpent, the snake, remember the fall of man, remember the snake in the garden? Because you have done this, cursed are you above all livestock and every beast on the field. On your belly you will go, and the dust you will eat all the days of your life. And I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed. He will crush your head, and you will strike his heel. Stop here, because this is a portrait that though there will be, through Satan's activity, an ability to kind of get at mankind, to try to damage us, that there will be something that ultimately crushes the head of the enemy. And we know now, as history gives us, that it was Jesus Christ. He became the gospel. He became the way that you and I could defeat death, hell, and the grave, to overcome sin in our life. And now, last week, unpacking that understanding of Jesus, we focus on the Gospels. Just one little thing here about Old Testament. We know that there was this consistent, Jesus is coming, the Messiah is coming, the Messiah is coming, and then God goes silent for 400 years. That's the break between the Old and the New Testament, called the silent years. God is silent, and then we go to the New Testament, and we have what we need to know about the life of the Messiah. And it kicks off with a great first book to talk about Jesus' life, Matthew. I put this in your notes. We're unpacking Matthew, and just so you know, Matthew is known as the tax collector. Tax collector. This is important, and I love that the first book of the New Testament, outlining the Gospels, talking about Jesus' life, starts with Matthew, the tax collector. I know some of you would think about the tax collector, and it's probable that many of you are thinking, yeah, that does seem kind of funky that, Jesus would choose this guy Matthew. That's what happened. Jesus chose Matthew to be one of the disciples, to be one of the 12, to be the beginning to this whole movement. Jesus chooses Matthew, a tax collector, and some of you are thinking, that doesn't make sense because I'm thinking of the IRS right now, and that God would use somebody from the IRS seems a little odd. Well, guys, this dude is worse than the IRS. That's what, if you don't understand about history, you need to know this, that he was a Jewish man given the authority by the Roman government to collect taxes from his own people and give it to the Romans who were already despised. He had the ability to collect whatever taxes the Romans wanted, but also make a nice little livelihood for himself and tax the people above and beyond the Roman government to meet whatever lifestyle he wanted to have. Guys, he would have been considered a thief or a robber to the Jewish people. He would have been disliked. And check this out. God picks Matthew. I love that because I can relate to that. I don't know about you, but that God would use somebody like Matthew with such a checkered past to be in that early group. I can relate to that because I think about my past and that God used me. And I don't know about you, and maybe some of you are like, yeah, and God's used me as well, and I've got a pretty wonky past in my life. If you're here tonight, and you know what, you had a pretty checkered past, but God is still using you, and you came to know Christ, and God is using you in a powerful way despite what happened to you in the past, would you just give a shout? Is there anybody here like me? So yeah, I like that, and I like that Matthew, the tax collector, he is credited with the writing of this text. I want to give you some thoughts about this text. We're doing Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and it feels like I'm going to have to be a professor up here, teach all these books. There's just a lot of text here. How do I cover one book of the Bible in one short sermon? How to do that? Here's what I'm just going to do. I'm going to focus on some of the critical things that are throughout the text, highlight some things, and then we'll finish our time together. And the first thing that I put in your notes that I find so fascinating about what Matthew gives us is the first book of this book of the Bible, the first chapter of this book of the Bible, and the first verse, Matthew busts right out with genealogy. And I know you could read this and you'd be like, man, this is boring. Genealogy. He starts going like, okay, and so Jesus came from this family and this family and this family and this family. And he goes back all these generations, and that can get a little bit boring. But folks, you need to understand how historically significant this is. The genealogy. Matthew breaks out with it right away. And his main desire, I put in your notes, is to bring forth the genealogy to prove that Jesus was the Messiah, that he was the coming King of the Jews that had been promised throughout all of history. And he's going to open up with a text that he says, basically he's saying, I'm going to prove it to you right now by just giving you genealogy. And he works his way back through all the Old Testament, all the promises of how the Messiah would come about. But it starts out in Matthew 1 and verse 1. It says, this is the genealogy of Jesus, the what? The Messiah that had been promised, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Guys, that this lineage is coming from a great root, a great family root. In fact, the root that had always been promised throughout the Old Testament. And he says, man, guys, it said in the scripture that the Messiah would come from the line of David. And it happened. In fact, go back to 2 Samuel chapter 7, and here's the prophecy about David and the Messiah coming out of his family. It says in 2 Samuel 7, verse 11, the Lord declares to you that the Lord himself, David, this is the prophet Samuel receiving from God and delivering to David. It says, the Lord declares to you, David, that the Lord himself will establish a house for you. When your days are over and you rest with your ancestors, I will raise up for your offspring to succeed you, your own flesh and blood, and I will establish his kingdom. That out of David's loins, out of his life, that there would come forth this promise of not some earthly king, but this is a reference to something much bigger than an earthly king. And so this is the Old Testament saying that Jesus would come from this new house, this house of David and this lineage of David. And now Now Matthew is saying, yes, I'm going to trace the lineage of Jesus. I'm tracing it all the way back to David, just like the scriptures promise, but it goes even before that. I mean, we can go all the way back to where Jacob's telling Judah, hey, from your loins, there's going to be this incredible thing that's going to change all of human history and all of mankind. And we go back to the story of Abraham, and remember God's promise is that Abraham would come forth from Abraham the blessing to all nations. Jesus became that as the Messiah. Not just for Israel, but now if you go to Israel, I've been to Israel, and if you go there, you see all these nations there seeking to see the history of Jesus Christ. Not just Jews, but now all the nations have come to know, many nations across our world have come to know, people in those nations come to know Jesus Christ. Our world is being blessed by this promise that became a reality. Folks, you need to know that this is a Jewish legal document that Matthew is presenting. It is of a legal authority. If a genealogy would have been presented for somebody high level or a king or a leader, and those records would have been kept in the temple. And in the temple, anybody could go, if they wanted to, they could have these acts, well, anybody with authority could go there and have access to the documentation that Matthew is citing, and he's saying, look, we can trace Jesus back all the way in this powerful lineage. He's preparing a legal document. You know, the temple was destroyed, but before it was destroyed, Matthew is saying, it's all there, go look. And this undisputed claim he's making about the lineage of Jesus makes its way into this text. What I love about this text, though, is it's not just, you know, the rich lineage of people like David and Abraham in the text, you know, going all the way back. I love that there's some pretty wacky people in this lineage too. I mean, if you go back and you see people like Ruth, the Moabite, I mean, if you understand history, you would not want a Moabite in your lineage. And yet it's there in the text. And what about Tamar? And she's pretty shady. And she's there in the lineage as well. And so there's this honesty, but at the very end of this genealogy, Matthew brings it to a close with this text. And Jacob, the father of Joseph. Now we've gotten all the way to Joseph, the daddy, certainly in the family of where Jesus was born, not the biological father, because remember Jesus was born of a Virgin Mary. It says Jacob, the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary, and Mary. He makes this shift here, and Mary was the mother of Jesus, who is called the Messiah. He makes this very important shift where it's in the singular feminine text that says that she, though, not him, that she is the one basically that bore the child, and ultimately he's making the statement here that Joseph his blood is not in this Messiah. This human blood and all the deficiencies and yes, there's a glorious heritage and there's these deficiencies as well. But because he's born of a virgin, that Joseph is not, we're tracing Joseph's lineage, but he's technically not the birthing father, the biological father. So then we understand that in this shift, Matthew is saying that he was born of a virgin. He's helping us understand that Jesus was 100% God, 100% man, all at once, that he doesn't have these impurities and these imperfections, though Joseph's family heritage did, and the promise became a reality that Jesus would come from this family line, be born into this family. I take a couple things away before I move on to the next thing, and I just want to share two things with you. I've already touched on them, but if I was thinking about great takeaways from this genealogy, I'm thinking about the legal documentation that Matthew is making here, and how if you were just looking for something that was so powerful to say, okay, prove about Jesus' life, understanding the historical nature of that text alone is powerful. But I take away something else. I think about the imperfections in that bloodline. And I think about the impurities, and I've got them in, we've all got some pretty messed up family. And we all come from some pretty odd backgrounds at times. Yet Jesus Christ, despite all of that, and for all of that, came so that you and I could be made new and a part of a new family in Jesus Christ. I love that about the genealogy, so don't miss that. That's important. And then, you get into the birth of Jesus, and we won't spend time on that because we see this in other Gospels as well. But I want to talk about the next thing that's in your notes. I want to talk about the Beatitudes and the Sermon on the Mount. Sermon on the Mount is a rich 3 books of Matthew 5, 6, and 7, where Jesus is teaching what's considered the most incredible sermon in all of human history. And he begins to download some of the most valuable Christian principles that you and I could want. You want to know what the gospel is in a lot of ways, just read Matthew 5, 6, and 7 from the standpoint of what Jesus came for all who believe. It's in this text, the Beatitudes, and the Beatitudes are a total part of Matthew 5, 6, and 7 and the Sermon on the Mount. This place that Jesus preaches from is not fancy. It's so beautiful portrait. This is so powerful because Jesus does not sit and he doesn't go to this place and teach this incredible sermon in some wonderful hoity-toity chair in the temple. He doesn't go to some spectacular place. He doesn't even go to the side of Mount Zion, this historical mountain, to preach this text. He goes to a hillside in a place that history would have said during that time is a wasteland. He gets up onto that hillside and he begins to teach. His disciples were there. Scriptures tell us large crowds were there. Thousands is what historians believe was there in this moment. Jesus takes this place on this mountainside by the Sea of Galilee and begins to teach and preach. By the way, I'm trying to let this come to life for you, but been there. My wife and I been there, and I had the privilege of standing in the very area it was believed where Jesus would have been preaching and teaching from, and I actually got to teach out of this part of the Bible from this very location. And this is the hillside. I'm standing there, and at the top there's a truck that was not there when Jesus was there, but and there were large crowds, and you begin to think, like, man, how did they hear him? Well, when you get into that place, you can begin to sense the acoustics there and how amazing it was on the hillside and him down, and then would have been behind me off to this direction have been the Sea of Galilee, and there is an acoustical effect. And Jesus comes to this hillside. There's some rocks up there, and he's like, no, nothing fancy here. No, that's not what I came for. But let me just deliver to you what I did come for. And he begins to share. I want to spend a little time just talking about the Beatitudes. That's what I'm going to focus on mostly because there's so much if we go into 5, 6, and 7. But think about for just a moment all of these people coming from different places, hearing about Jesus the Messiah, making their way. Guys, it's hot. These people are probably coming through some hot weather, miles on donkeys with families and people to say, man, we got to hear him. I mean, how desperate do you need to be to make that journey to hear from this guy? And they make the journey to hear from him. The day we were there, it was beautiful. I think at the moment I was speaking, it may have been in the 70s. But the next day, it was going to hit like 100. And so most of the days are generally going to be pretty hot. And they wanted to be there so bad to hear what Jesus said. And in this place, Jesus does not disappoint. He sits down, he begins to share it, he begins to preach and teach what we know as the Sermon on the Mount. Let's look, though, at the Beatitudes. And Jesus, in the Beatitudes, he begins to deliver the biggies to all of life when it comes to the gospel. Let me read these. It's not going to be on the screen, but let me just read these. Those of you maybe are familiar with this text, you know the Beatitudes, but let me just read this. It says, now when Jesus saw the crowds, he went up on a mountainside. He sat down. His disciples came to him, and he began to teach them. He said, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are those who are meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called the children of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are the people who, though they insult you and persecute you and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me, look, rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven. For in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you. 8 blessings that come from a life of following Jesus and having Christ in your life. This word blessed in the text comes from this root of something that would be called happy. It's a more in-depth portrait of happiness. If you wanted, you could put the word happy instead of blessed there, because that's kind of the understanding of what Jesus is saying, is that in what I'm doing for all of mankind, Jesus is saying, this is new. This is what's going to happen. And there's going to be a joy and a happiness in your life, not based on happenstance, not based on a happiness based on your circumstances, but some sort of joy that can enter your life through the gospel, through what Jesus is going to do, so that a type of a level of fulfillment that goes beyond any other thing that this world could ever offer. In fact, this word blessed comes from this classical Greek word called summum bonum, which means the good life forever. 8 principles right here from Jesus. He says, man, this is how, you want to know what the good life forever looks like? And he gives those principles. We know them as the Beatitudes, but when you continue on in the Sermon on the Mount, these incredible teachings we get from it. The Beatitudes, of course, the Lord's Prayer, loving your enemies, talking about being salt and light in this world, talking about an eye for an eye, how to fast, giving to the kingdom, not worrying about things of the future, the narrow gate versus the wide gate, true and false prophets, true and false disciples, wise builders versus foolish builders, all packed into this powerful sermon about the gospel. And Matthew records it, and you can go back and read it. In fact, in the text that I'm giving you, in your notes, I'll write a chapter there where a lot of these things are highlighted, these critical chapters, and I want to challenge you to go read this. Did you know that that's what believers do? They read their Bible. Did you know that? Okay, I'm just making sure. So you could go and you could read this text and say, okay, you know, I just heard we talked about this, and now you're unpacking it. In fact, you could read all of this. I'll give you, I mean, this is kind of a little clue, but we did Matthew this week. What do you reckon is next week? Mark. Okay. So you could actually get a head start on Mark if you wanted as well. But take these chapters, read these, study these in the scriptures, and learn more. Here's another thing in your notes that's important: the sending of the 12. Jesus gathers 12 disciples, teaches, they watch him healing, they watch him do these incredible things. He gets these fishermen. He goes down to this place on the Sea of Galilee called Capernaum, and he finds these fishermen, finds some other people from other places, and then he comes back to Capernaum after he's been teaching and sharing things with them, and he begins to say, like, I'm sending you now. You're going to go. Capernaum. You can go there today and stand in the very place where Jesus would have found these fishermen and said, hey, come on with me. In fact, I have a picture of that very location on the shores of Capernaum. Right here is where Jesus would have called some of these fishermen and said, come on now with me. And he then gathers, he gathers all these disciples that he's gathering, and he begins to teach them and comes back to Capernaum. And he says, now I want you to know something. You're going to go now. You're going to go. We're not just going to gather and do our thing for the rest of your lives. We're not going to just like be comfortable hanging out all the time and make it our 12 and no more. We're going to go, and you're going to share so much of what you've learned. You're going to do some incredible things that I've done, and you're going to now spread the good news. He's there back in Capernaum. I have another picture of Capernaum, which is nothing but ruins now. Many biblical cities are thriving, but Jesus said this would be one of 3 cities that would one day be completely empty. And it is completely empty. It's one of 3 biblical cities that he said would be desolate and cursed, and this is one of them. And you go there today, and there's pretty much nothing there. What was a vibrant, thriving place, just like Jesus said, is empty. But in Matthew Chapter 10, verse 1, he's gathering now the disciples, and he says, Jesus called his 12 disciples to him and gave them the authority to drive out impure spirits and to heal every disease and sickness. Like, I'm going to send you all out now. This is important because, folks, where you're seated today is because the 12 went. In the United States of America, in Zephyr Hills, sitting in New Walk Church, this church is here because the 12 didn't just sit around and keep it all to themselves. They went and they shared with all nations. And you sit in a church today because of this moment in history. And I love that. So I wanted to put that in there, that this is a portrait of what all disciples do. We go and we share. You and I, as believers, we go and we share and we let other people know about what Christ has done and the miracles and the things that he's done in my own life and the things that we've seen in other people's lives. But he spends a lot of time in Matthew 10 reminding the disciples that it won't be easy, that you will have times where you are rejected. And if you've been a believer long enough, you know that you could tell people about what Jesus has done and what you could tell people about Jesus and you could get rejected. So he's warning then that it can happen. It's still happening today. Let me give you one of those texts out of Matthew 10, verse 35. For I have come to turn man against his father, daughter against her mother, daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. A man's enemies will be members of his own household. Folks, that's rough. But that is still true today. That you could come to know Christ in your family and be rejected by people in your own family. And some of you have experienced this firsthand. And so do not be surprised when that rejection happens. Still happening today. Jesus right here, he said, guys, it will not be easy, but we go and we proclaim this message. Another key text here is this, Jesus in parables about the kingdom in Matthew 13. The parables about the kingdom. Jesus, this is important too, the parables part. In Psalm it says that who the Messiah, when the Messiah comes, he will speak always in parables. Did Jesus speak a lot of parables? Yes. And so just another prophecy written hundreds of years before Jesus, that when the Messiah comes, he will speak in parables. And that's exactly how Jesus taught. Parables about the kingdom of God in this particular instance. And we see this text as Jesus trying to explain like what the kingdom does and how incredible and massive it is. He says this. He told them another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed, which a man took and planted in his field. Though it is the smallest of all seeds, yet when it grows, it is the largest of garden plants and becomes a tree, so that the birds come and perch in its branches. That the kingdom of heaven starts out with things that are small and just expands and grows and becomes a blossoming thing. This applies to you and I at your level. It's something like this, that in my family, maybe you became the first believer. And it just from there, it began to sprout. Not everybody took hold, but it began to sprout more and more. And that little seed of your faith began to grow. This plays out in this church where it started with just my wife and I, and now we have what we have at New Walk here all weekend long. Just a little seed, and the kingdom begins to grow and grow. But there's something even bigger that Jesus wants us to understand, and it's found a little later in Matthew 13. It says, he told them still another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like yeast that a woman took and mixed into about 60 pounds of flour until it worked all through the dough. The kingdom is unstoppable. And people are still trying to stop the spreading of the gospel, and it just keeps spreading and spreading and spreading, and it gets everywhere and into everything, because that's what the kingdom is going to do, and the message of Jesus cannot be stopped. Here's this last part of that parable. It says, Jesus spoke all these things to the crowd in parables. He did not say anything to them without using a parable. So was fulfilled, I mentioned this a second ago, fulfilled what was spoken through the prophet. I will open my mouth in parables. I will utter things hidden since the creation of the world. This prophecy becomes a reality in Jesus. The kingdom is so massive, it's powerful. Folks, what God is doing at a mustard seed level and growing here in East Pasco through this church is amazing. And yet, we have a lot of work to do. One of the biggest things we do is coming up at Christmas time. It's our Christmas at New Walk event. It's going to be a huge event here at the church and reaching our community. And I want to just roll out to you what's happening. I know you're like, it's the beginning of November. Yeah, I got a reason I want to share this with you, but here's what Christmas at New Walk is going to be Saturday and Sunday. That's the 22nd and the 23rd. We will have 8 different services, 4 on Saturday and 4 on Sunday. You see 2 in the morning, 2 at night, 2 in the morning, 2 at night, same times there on both days. But what's cool is right above that, 35 tons of snow, sledding, all that's going to be taking place for the kids and maybe some bigger kids too. But I know we always get the northerners who are new, and because we haven't done the snow in a few years, the real snow. And some of the northerners, they go, you pay for that? Like, because where I'm from, it's pretty free. And I understand that. But yes, and it's a big deal in our community. We're going to have a lot of people show up for that. Did you know, I don't know if you know this, but a part of the DNA of our church is that it's really not about the snow. We utilize that to get them here, but they must hear Jesus first. That's what we do at our church. So yeah, we love that. Those are the times, but in order to do the outreach we do at Christmas and some other things, once a year we do a special offering, not 5 times a year. Once a year we do a special offering. It's called the Christmas offering. And I'm rolling that out. I told you 2 weeks ago I was going to roll this out, and I want to do that. On every seat, you got a card about our Christmas offering, and there's different levels that you can give, be a part of the Christmas offering. We just ask you to take that home, pray about how you and your family can be a part of the offering, whatever level God speaks to you, but please pray. Isn't it? On our human flesh, we think about things, but God's bigger. So just seek God for this. If you're married, your spouse, take a time to pray and meet back together and say, this is what we think our family ought to do, can do. This is more about everybody being a part of something and not just a portion of our church. And our church has done better and better at this every year, where people say, we're all going to be a part of this. I'm not going to leave this for the person in my row. I'm not going to leave this for somebody sitting behind me. I am going to take my part and do my part myself. There's different levels and ways for you to be a part of this, but we are funding 3 key things in our church that I want to just tell you about. First of all, Christmas at New Walk and all the outreach there. The second is our work in the Dominican, and we go every year. We send a team to the Dominican, and the work that we're doing there is really incredible to reach people there in the Dominican, so we have some money going to that. And then we're doing some seed money for a really cool thing that's launching in 2019. We've been doing this Wild at Heart men's trip, and we've been waiting for this to happen. Now it's finally here. There's going to be a women's trip. Yeah, pretty cool. And we want to stand behind that and fund some of that. We're going to use the Christmas offering for that as well. We are so excited about that. We'll have more about that after the first of the year and all things. But we want to get and say, hey, you know what, as a church, let's stand behind that so the ladies can get off to a good start with that trip. Again, what can your family do? Not just, don't leave this for somebody else. So what can our family do? What we ask you to do is drop in the offering bucket what your family's pledge is going to be. There's a place you can mark that. And do that before the end of November. And then before the end of December, we ask that you will have given, you can do a little bit each week or twice a week, that you will have given, fulfilled your pledge by the end of the year. Simple enough. You're praying now. What can we do? Drop that in the offering bucket over the next couple of weeks and then begin to give. You can give online at our website. You can give through the app. You can give through the kiosk. You can drop money in the offering bucket and designate it. And again, I want to be clear. This is above and beyond what we normally do together. So don't replace. Don't take from here. And this is above and beyond what we might normally do. And we will have a huge Christmas at New Walk and reach a lot of people and beyond, and the women's trip and the Dominican, if we all, not some, all of us, get on board. Here's the next thing in your notes. This parable in Matthew 18, greatness in the kingdom. Greatness in the kingdom. You find this in Matthew 18, and it says this. It says, talking about, they're having this argument like, okay, when we go to heaven, who did the most to be the best in heaven? And Jesus gets this refresh and says, you need to understand what your role is here on earth. And he utilizes a child to kind of get them to understand their role. And it says this. It says, at that time, the disciples came to Jesus and asked, who then is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? He called a little child to him and placed the child among them. And he said, truly, I tell you, unless you change and become like little children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven, because you're making it all about people seeing you and you looking important. It's not about that. He says, therefore, whoever takes the lowly position of this child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven, and whoever welcomes one such child in my name welcomes me. Is lowly child mentality. In other words, it's a portrait of the child looking up and looking up. Not looking down on people, but looking up. And I wrote this down in my notes. As children in the faith, As believers in the faith, we should do what a child does. A child clings to their father. A child wants to learn from their father. A child wants to hang out with the father. A child wants the provision of the father. A child craves to be fed. I want to know more. I want to grow more. The child is in awe. A child of the faith is in awe of the things of God, in awe of faith steps in general. A child wants to do ultimately the work of the father. And Jesus is saying, this is the positioning. And so I wrote these down in my notes, just some questions for you. Are you in the faith as though a child who wants to learn regularly from the Father? Are you in the faith as a child who wants to hang out in times of devotion and prayer with the Father? Are you as a child that wants to discover the provision of the Father? Are you, as a child in the faith, not how many years you've been a believer, but in your seeking to know more and grow more, are you craving to be fed? Are you in awe of the things of God and the things of faith? Are you as though a child that wants to continually do the work of the Father? Jesus says, you want to be great? Get in that positioning. The last thing that's critical in Matthew is chapter 24 and 25. It talks about judgment. 2 chapters about judgment. This is not the most fun part. But judgment is real. And Jesus, in particular, in this time, he's looking beyond death, burial, and resurrection to end times. Specifically, in these 2 chapters, that's what most of it, what we're dealing with. These end times, it's hard to think about the things that Jesus is going to be talking about here, and I'll get to them in a second, but it's hard because we live in a world where we want happy ending, everything to end up perfectly, you know, the 3 little pigs and Bernstein Bears, you know. We want it all to end beautifully, happily ever after. But when we read Matthew 24 and 25, we see that it's not always happily ever after. That there's a judgment. Talking about Christ's return, specifically, that when Christ returns, there's going to be a separation of the believers and the non-believers. Christ's return is referred to as something as the rapture. It's like a snatching. I hear people say, I hear skeptics, I know there's skeptics here, and you're like, I don't know, man, I like things of Christianity, but I struggle with that one. So you believe he rose from the dead and has forgiven you of your sin, but you do not believe he will return again. Like, I don't understand. Like, if you already believe the one, then this is a piece of cake. He said he's going to return. 2 chapters dealing with this. Folks, you may not like it. You may be a skeptic, but if it's truth, it's truth. I can't change it. And the truth is Jesus says he will return. Now, again, there's always some wacky people in every generation who like to proclaim that they know when Jesus is coming back. Whack-a-doodle-doo. Ignore that, because Jesus says, he says multiple times, no one knows the day or the hour. He just says in these 2 chapters, be ready. Because when he returns, it is done. It is finished. All decisions have been made and everything has been completed. Here's what it says in Matthew 24 and verse 31. When the Son of Man comes in his glory and all the angels with him, he will sit on his glorious throne. All the nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate people one from another as shepherds separate sheep from the goats. And he will put the sheep on his right and the goats on his left. This is a portrait of the separation when Jesus returns. And so he spends time over these 2 chapters saying, be ready, be in ready position. He gives these parables about people that aren't ready, that they're not prepared, that they're not in the right position. He gives one about 10 bridesmaids who, you know, are a part of this wedding, and he begins to talk about how 5 get it right and 5 get it wrong. Talking about being prepared. He gives this parable. He talks about these bridesmaids, and he says it's like that of a wedding. You like to talk about weddings. So he's like, it's like that of a wedding. And you've got these 10 bridesmaids that are a part of the wedding, and some of them understand how to be ready, some of them don't. Back during that time, a wedding could be long, a very long thing. And it could go into the night. It could go after midnight. But there was an occasion in the wedding, Jesus talks about this, where they would go from the bride's house in something of that of a parade and journey to the groom's house. And the bridesmaids would be waiting along sort of think about it like a parade route. And Jesus said, you need to have these lanterns with plenty of oil because it could be late at night. You don't know when it's going to happen, so have plenty of oil in your lantern so that you have plenty of light. But that light is also going to be what's going to be used to signify who's allowed in the groom's home when they finally reach the groom's destination. And so Jesus is saying like, hey, these 10 bridesmaids, you need to have those lanterns filled and lit because when the parade comes from one to the other, it will be important to have them lit. Well, 5 of them had plenty of oil. They had their lamps lit. And when the party was moving from one to the other, they were well prepared. They go to the house. They knock on the door. They're received in because they're recognized by those lamps of being a part of the bridal party. Then Jesus says, but there was another 5 that weren't ready. And they didn't take heed. They didn't take the advice. They didn't take the warning. They didn't have the lamps ready. They didn't have enough oil. And they realize now that their lamps are not lit, and that's important to get into the house. And they're scrambling. They're running around. They're trying to find oil. They go to the 7-Eleven. They can't find any there. Where can I get more oil? And then they go to the house without those lamps lit, and they are rejected from the home. They were not prepared. They were not ready. This is a very difficult but real portrait of a judgment. And guys, there's a judgment at the return of Christ, and there's also a personal judgment before Christ returns for our own lives and when we draw our own last breath. Are you ready? If Christ were to return today, is the lamp lit? Are you ready? Have you taken the warnings? You've come in and out of church. Have you taken the advice? When the preacher said you need to be ready, have you decided to be ready? No one knows the day or the hour of Christ's return. No one knows the day or the hour of our own drawing of our own last breath. Are you ready? Would you bow your heads and pray with me? God, I know in a room this size that we have many believers here, and I praise God for that. And so maybe today is just a helper as we study Matthew, and there's an assurance for a lot of people here that lantern is lit, and they are that shining city on a hill for people around them. God, I thank you for that, and I praise you for that. But I also believe that there's people here that you've been warned, and that lamp still isn't lit. And the portrait that Jesus gives us is somebody trying to enter the master's house, but they didn't listen. And that moment of rejection. Have you made that decision? We don't like to think about the judgment sometimes, but Jesus spends a lot of time on it. Have you made that decision? I'm not trying to scare you. I'm just giving you the truth of that's all we're doing here. This is what Jesus said. The proof of the Messiah is so real. And now here he's saying these things are so real. If you have never entrusted Jesus in your life and that lamp is not lit, you could do it right now. Would you do it right now just from where you're seated? Would you turn to God and say, God, I accept the Messiah, the gift of Jesus, the gospel. I accept the proof, the evidences, the death, the burial, the resurrection, the eyewitness accounts, the prophecies, the text, the legality of the genealogy. Today, I accept it all. And I begin today this new journey in my life as a believer. God, light that lamp today. As your pastor, I cannot do it for you. So you're turning to God. And say, God, I turn to you now. I believe in the death and burial and resurrection of Jesus Christ as God's one and only Son for the forgiveness of my sins so that I might have a new life, a past that is forgiven, that I've been set free from my past, that I could operate into a new life and find the purpose, God, that you have for me, that you've designed for me, and I accept the gift of eternal salvation today. God, you have lit that lamp. My sin is forgiven. Saying just in your heart right now, God, I receive that. Again, I can't do it for you, but You say, God, I am ready tonight, and I accept that gift in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.